I want to start with a question that came to me while I was visiting the West earlier this year. I visited the Grand Canyon with a friend of mine, which, if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, it's one of those places that makes you feel genuinely small in the best way possible. I mean, the landscape is absolutely stunning. As we move through the scenery, as we talked about the history, as we move through the museums and the gift shops and the monuments, the question that was in the back of my head was, where are the Black people? Because we've been in the West, and I know that to be true, but yet so much of how the American West gets told, the stories, the mythology, and the imagery just leaves us out. And that question was still sitting with me when I picked up African American Women of the Old West by Tricia Martineau Wagner. And that book answered me loudly. We've heard of the myths of the Wild West, the cowboys, the outlaws, the gold rushes, but the history books have left out some of the most extraordinary people in that era. Black women who built businesses, fought legal battles, weathered through blizzards to deliver mail, ran newspapers, and carved out spaces for themselves in a country where all the odds were stacked against them in every way possible. Today, I want to talk about 4 women. And before we get into their individual stories, I think that it's very important for me to set the stage. Because the truth is, context matters. And in order to really appreciate what these women did and how they have impacted our society as a whole, we have to start with the background. So let's get into the westward expansion. From the early 1800s through the end of the century, the United States was aggressively pushing its borders west. The government promoted this under the idea of manifest destiny, and this was the belief that it was America's God-given right to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Millions of people migrated west, chasing land, gold, and opportunity. But what this mythology conveniently leaves out was the people that were already there in the West, and this included indigenous people. They were displaced, killed, and forced to live on reservations. And also, this mythology excludes the people that were forced to do the labor and build these Western communities. This included Black men, women, and children. Those were the laborers, and those were the builders, and they have always been a part of this story. Now let's transition into slavery and emancipation. Most of the women we are talking about today were born into slavery. They did not choose this. They were born into a legal system that classified them as property, that separated families, that denied them literacy, wages, autonomy, and basic human dignity. The Civil War ended in 1865, and with it came emancipation, which was the legal end of slavery in the United States. For millions of Black Americans, this was a moment of profound joy, hard-won freedom, and just a time of newness and hope. But freedom on paper and freedom in practice were 2 very different things, which brings us to Reconstruction and its collapse. The Reconstruction era, roughly 1865 to 1877, was a real period of remarkable progress for Black people. I mean, Black men finally gained the right to vote. Black Americans were elected to public office, including the U.S. Senate, which becomes very relevant when we talk about Susie Ralph Cayton in a moment. Schools were built, families were united, and communities were formed. But Reconstruction was violently dismantled. White supremacist groups terrorized Black communities, and unfortunately, federal protection was withdrawn. By the late 1870s, the promise of Reconstruction had been largely crushed. Unfortunately, these were replaced by Black codes, convict leasing, and the long shadow of Jim Crow.
And so people, they think that Reconstruction just collapses on its own. And when you tell history in the passive voice, you miss a lot of the actual actors and a lot of the nuance at play. And so I wanted to challenge that by centering African Americans' journey in from slavery to freedom, to show everything that they achieved, and the fact that white extremists attacked them for their very success. And it's in attacking them and destabilizing and sort of tearing down everything that they built that they were able to get the system of Jim Crow segregation up and off the ground in order to roll back all of the progress African Americans made after they gained their freedom.
And yet, in spite of all of this hardship and turmoil, Black women moved west and they built homes, they started businesses, they raised their families, and they refused to be erased. And that is the world that we are stepping into today. Biddy Mason was born into slavery in 1818, and she was eventually brought to California by her enslaver, Robert Smith, who was part of the Mormon train. California had entered the Union as a free state in 1850, and Biddy Mason knew this. And when Smith tried to move her family to Texas, Biddy refused, and she did something absolutely remarkable. She petitioned the courts. She fought for her freedom and the freedom of her children and the other people that were enslaved with her. In 1856, a Los Angeles judge granted Biddy Mason and her family their freedom. But the story doesn't stop there, because Biddy Mason didn't just survive, she absolutely thrived. She became a nurse, a midwife, saved her earnings meticulously, and in 1860 she purchased land in Los Angeles for $250. That land will later on be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She used her wealth to found the first Black church in Los Angeles, the first American Methodist Episcopal Church, which still exists today. She opened her home to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the elderly, and she was one of the first Black women, the first Black people actually, to own land in Los Angeles. And she died in 1891 when her estate was worth nearly $300,000. Just let that sink in. A woman born enslaved, who fought for her freedom in court, who became a real estate mogul and philanthropist, who literally built community infrastructure in Los Angeles. I mean, I think that Biddy deserves her name in lights. Mary Fields was born into slavery around 1832 in Tennessee. After emancipation, she eventually made her way to Montana, where she worked at a Catholic mission school run by the Ursuline nuns. And listen, she was not there to blend in. Mary Fields was over 6 feet tall, built like a force of nature, and was known to carry a rifle, smoke cigars, and hold her own in a fight with just about anyone who crossed her. She was fiercely devoted to the nuns and the mission, and they were devoted right back to her, even when her, let's say, colorful personality caused friction with the local community. When she was in her 60s, she became the second woman and the first Black woman ever in U.S. history to carry mail. She ran a mail route in Montana and became legendary for never missing a delivery. If her horses couldn't get her through the snow, she strapped on her snowshoes and carried the mail herself. The town of Cascade, Montana adored her, and when she died in 1914, the whole town mourned. I mean, schools were closed in her honor, which at this time was something that was absolutely unheard of for a Black woman. Mary Fields was loud, she was bold, and she was unapologetically herself in a time and place where that could have gotten her killed. And she lived to be 80 years old, beloved by her friends, family, and her larger community. That is legacy. Next is a woman named Mary Jane Holmes Shipley, and her story is of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. Mary was born into slavery and eventually settled in the West after emancipation. Her life was defined by the particular brutality that Black women in this era face. What Wagner highlights in writing about Mary Jane is the way she rebuilt over and over again in the aftermath of loss and violence. She built a home, a family, and a life. And when those things were threatened or destroyed, she built it again. Her story represents the thousands of Black women in the post-Civil War West whose names we don't know, but whose stories are being recorded in this book. Mary Jane Holmes Shipley is a reminder that survival itself is a form of resistance, that keeping your family together, your community intact, and showing up every day in spite of what is going on around you is remarkable. It is resistance and it is history. It's Black history. Wagner does something important by including women like Mary Jane alongside the more well-documented figures. She insists that all of their lives matter, that history isn't just about the wealthy or the famous, it's made by the ones who endure. And last but not least, we have Susan Relves Clayton. Susan was the daughter of Hiram Relves, the first African American to serve in the U.S. Senate. So she came from a family that was already making history, and she absolutely carried this legacy forward. Susan moved to Seattle with her husband, Horace Clayton Sr., in the 1890s, and together they built something absolutely remarkable. They started the Seattle Republican, which was one of the most influential Black newspapers in the Pacific Northwest. And Susan wasn't just a supporting player in this venture, she was an intellectual powerhouse. She wrote, she edited, and she shaped the voice of the publication that spoke directly to and for the Black community in Seattle during an era when this community was growing and fighting for its place in a rapidly changing society. She was also the mother of children who themselves would go on to live significant lives. Her son, Horace Clayton Jr., became a prominent sociologist and civil rights figure. Susan Relves Clayton understood the power of being able to tell your own story. That telling your story was having the ability to control your own narrative. It was an act of liberation during a time when Black Americans were being misrepresented, erased, and ignored by mainstream media. And she helped to build a platform that said, we are here, our lives matter, and our stories will be told. These four women, Biddy Mason, Mary Fields, Mary Jane Holmes Shipley, and Susan Relves Clayton, are just a handful of the incredible stories that Wagner shares in her book. And what I love most about the African American women of the Old West is that it doesn't treat these women just as footnotes or curiosities. It treats them as subjects of histories, as people who lived, who existed, who made choices, who loved their community, who loved their friends and family, who took risks and changed the world around them. So the next time you visit the West, whether it's the Grand Canyon, Montana, Seattle, or Los Angeles, I want you to remember one thing, that Black women helped to build those places. They fought for them, they loved them, and they are woven into the land whether the monuments say so or not. If accurate American history is something that you enjoy, I think that you should definitely check out this book. And as always, I want to hear your comments below. Which one of these stories stuck out to you the most? I mean, for me, I think that all of these women are incredible, but Mary Fields, also known as the Stagecoach Mary, might actually have my whole entire heart, just because she was very bold and unapologetic. And we know that for Black women living in the US, that is a very tall task. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.